We should open our minds to the new world of Eastern Europe, look at the world that has been created in the last 20 years. What is the challenge to us coming out of that? What can we learn? How can we learn to bring that new world into our mindset? So tonight is not really to look back once again at the historical events of 1989 and what went before that, but really much more to address the contemporaneity of Eastern European life today. So I want to thank Professor Moray McGowan for really bringing together an exciting perspective into arts and humanities research on Eastern European culture and life. And I leave it to you, Moray, to open this symposium.
Thank you, Paul. As Paul Holman said, I'm the Moray McGowan Professor of German in the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultural Studies. I'm also a member of the executive of the Longroom Hub, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th Louis Glucksman Symposium. These symposia are made possible by the generosity of Dr. Loretta Brennan Glucksman in memory of her husband, Louis Glucksman, who was also a passionate champion and supporter of the arts and humanities. It's always good to be able to acknowledge their support on these occasions. Now, the title of the 7th Louis Glucksman Memorial Symposium tonight is Language, Culture and the Press in Eastern Europe since 1989. And in a moment, I'll introduce our 3 international speakers on this topic. I want to just pick up a point that Paul's already touched on. And of course, given the intense media attention in this 20th anniversary year of 1989, no one surely needs reminding that Europe's been transformed by the events of that year and their aftermath. This is true throughout Eastern Europe, of course, but it's true also in the West, which has changed profoundly, not least Ireland, of course, not least the remarkable demographic and cultural transformation of this country, which has a great deal to do with the economic, cultural and linguistic contribution now being made to Ireland by people from Eastern Europe. And although economic downturn may slow that process down, I'm sure it's not going to reverse it. We're in a totally different world in many ways here as well than we were in 1989. Now, 1989, especially in this anniversary year, 2009, has all too often been reduced to a single iconic date, the 9th of November 1989, and a single iconic event, the opening of the Berlin Wall. And this is actually a rather interesting version of that, which precedes that date by 23 years. It's the spoof version of James Bond, the James Bond film Casino Royale, released in 1967, sorry. And if you watch carefully, you'll see the opening of the Berlin Wall coming up in a moment.
The whole scheme was a failure.
And also Dr. Now knows what you've been up to.
What now?
Just have to raise the money.
But how?
How? By playing baccarat.
But Le Chiffre, what about me?
What's going to happen to me?
Thanks, Joseph. There you have it, the huddled masses of Eastern Europe, huddled behind the wall, bursting through at that first moment of freedom. Because this is a singular distortion and a simplification of history, of course, not just there, but actually even reducing everything to the 9th of November 1989 and the opening of the Berlin Wall is a simplification of history. It's a simplification even with regard to Germany. It becomes grotesquely so when the events of one night in Germany are taken to represent the whole complexities of the changes in Eastern Europe which took place not only during that year but before it and after it. And redressing some of that imbalance is very much the idea behind tonight's programme, for which we brought together 3 distinguished scholars from Eastern Europe, whom I'd now like to introduce. It's Professor Ruta Marcinkiewicz from Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas in Lithuania, Professor Piotr Piotrowski from the director of the National Museum in Warsaw, and Dr. Thomas Kamusela, who is Thomas Brown Lecturer in Polish Studies here at Trinity College and also an Associate Professor at the University of Opole in Poland. And our three speakers will each speak for about 25 minutes, and that will be followed by time for questions and discussion, so that we'll be closing at 9 o'clock tonight. So let me move then to introduce our first speaker. We're very pleased to welcome Professor Ruta Marcinkiewicz, who is Vice President of the Research Council of Lithuania. She's Director of the Centre for Computational Linguistics at Kaunas University. She's published very widely in linguistics, especially corpus linguistics, that linguistic and stylistic analysis of very large collections of text from which the subtle and less subtle shifts of in a language and a culture can be observed. And I think some of that critical interest in how texts work has informed her interest in the development of journalism in Eastern Europe, which is her theme tonight. She's going to speak to us on changing journalistic cultures in the Baltic states, and I ask you to join me in giving her a very warm welcome to Dublin.
Dear attendees of Glucksman Memorial Symposium, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for drawing attention to the transformations in Central and Eastern Europe while addressing the 20th anniversary of the event of the 1989. The most important revolutionary event of the year for the three Baltic states was the action called Baltic Route, organized on August 23rd in order to commemorate 50th anniversary of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop protocols. The song that you heard, the beginning of it, and the photos, I think, convey the spirit of the event. Let me remind you shortly that with the secret protocols, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided the countries of Central and Eastern Europe between themselves, and the three Baltic states were incorporated into the Soviet Union. In 1990, they proclaimed their independence and underwent a radical social and political transformation. Media actually was the most sensitive and tangible, conspicuous sphere of changes. Therefore, in my talk, I will concentrate on the transformations of media during the last 2 decades. Why are post-Soviet media developments so special and peculiar? Because the transformation in the Baltic societies were abrupt and rapid. A lot happened in an extremely compressed and short period of time. Moreover, the changes were complex and multilateral, as they simultaneously took place on multiple levels and in different political, economical, and social realms. In addition, local changes in the fields of media and politics of the newborn democracies were coupled with multiple external pressures, such as globalization, modernization, regional integration, technological diffusion, digitalization, and some others. Finally, transformations took place in diverse cultural contexts and difficult economical situations. Lack of material resources, lack of knowledge, lack of skills, as well as democratic political structure to meet these external and internal challenges put our countries under huge stress. Internal and external factors caused diverse transformations. Nevertheless, they had one common feature. Most of them were far from what can be called a smooth development towards the democratic society and democratic media institutions. Last 2 decades comprise several distinct periods of media reforms, some common features of the countries and main trends of the development of the journalistic culture. Journalistic culture is defined with the help of 4 dimensions: the structure of mass media markets, role of the state, political parallelism, professionalization of journalism. These dimensions, proposed by Daniel Hallin and Paolo Mancini in their seminal book Comparing Media Systems, provide a very good theoretical framework for the analysis of relationship between political and media systems. I will add one more dimension, that is the type of media discourse, which reflects the 4 above-mentioned aspects. Since I will attempt to overview 2 decades in 3 countries, my talk is inevitably abstract and general, with dominating Lithuanian perspective. However, I hope to demonstrate that more systematic approach is required to understand what is going on in this part of Europe. There were numerous attempts to apply a number of theoretical models in order to describe media systems in post-communist countries in general and post-Soviet Baltic countries in particular. In spite of these multiple attempts, there is no such a model. Media analysts agree that Baltic countries with their complex reality do not fit neatly in any of the pure types and could be best described with the help of a mixed model. Therefore, the transformations in both the political and the media fields should be analyzed via an integrated approach. Talking about phases and periods, I'd like to refer you to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who has analyzed the major political, economic, and legal changes in Eastern Europe during the post-communist transformation. He identified 3 phases of development, starting from the breakthrough, going through the changes, and ending with the development of a stable democratic system. Actually, in our countries, there were 3 major thresholds. 1989 up to 92 was the period of diversification of our media. Up to 96 was the period of politicized and political press. The year 2000 could be seen as the end of transition, and the 21st century could be described as the period of media convergence, tabloid and commercialized press and broadcast. During the first periods, media markets of the Baltic states were facing rapid changes. Since 1989, only national groups have owned mass media market. Up to mid-90s, small shareholders prevailed, and in the end of 90s, ownership concentration took place. In general, media market has more investment from local capital than from foreign investors, mostly from Nordic countries, Norway and Sweden. Media systems and journalism practices in the Baltic states can be studied and researched as belonging to a single group of media systems with defining characteristics such as having a small market. And I'd like to tell the numbers of populations. It's 1.3 million in Estonia, 2.4 million in Latvia, and 3.4 million in Lithuania. What does it mean to be small? Small countries have many peculiar characteristics which directly or indirectly affect their media structure and media regulation. Shortage of resources, small audiences, and advertising markets directly affect journalistic production. Larger and wealthier markets with bigger resources available can afford a greater diversity of content output. Moreover, small countries are more severely affected by global influences. They have less resources, human and financial, to produce high-quality domestic products and to compete with foreign production. At the same time, small countries with their specific languages are less vulnerable and less exposed to competition from abroad. This is exactly the case in the Baltic states, where media regulation is very liberal and there are no restrictions on media ownership of foreign investors. To conclude, being small implies constraints and problems. Indeed, it's more difficult to be small than big. Another analytical dimension is the role of the state, and it could be described with a citation from the Constitution of Lithuania adopted in 1992. Censorship of mass media should be prohibited. The state, political parties, and other institutions or persons may not monopolize means of mass media. Why is censorship an issue in the Constitution? A glimpse into our histories can explain it. The three Baltic countries share almost identical geopolitical situation and their political histories have certain similarities. At the end of the 18th century, all three countries, as well as parts of Poland and Finland, were incorporated into the Tsar's Russia. Later, in the first half of the 20th century, they established independent states. And in 1940, they were, after incorporation in the Soviet Union, once again, they have disappeared from the world map for 50 years. Throughout the last 2 centuries, the freedom of the press has been a problematic issue, especially in Lithuania, but the same in other 2 Baltic countries. They have gone through harsh periods of press censorship and Russification, especially in the second half of the 19th century. After the second rebellion against the Tsar, Lithuania underwent a ban of Latin letters. For more than 4 decades, books in the mainland of the country were printed in Russian alphabet Kirillitsa. Lithuanian books, much more numerous, in Latin script were published in Königsberg or Tilsit, that is in Lithuania Minor, and they were smuggled into mainland and read and used secretly in private schools. This period gave rise to a unique phenomenon of book smuggling and national heroes that supported it, book smugglers and secret private house teachers. They took the great risk because if founded, they were exiled to Siberia and deprived of their houses. The ban was lifted in 1904, but the censorship remained. Freedom of the press was achieved only when independent states were established on the eastern side of the Baltic Sea in 1918. And during the Soviet period, the media was strictly supervised and regulated by the Communist Party and its apparatus. Control embraced not only censorship of the printed press, but also of all the public sphere, books, films, theater, cinema, exhibitions. And when free communication is suppressed or made otherwise impossible, a cultural sphere acquires a certain consolidative function. Indeed, in Soviet times, free spirit of the Baltic nations was mainly maintained with the help of specific Aesopian language of implications, hints, and understatement, metaphorical theater, and other means to convey meaning that was hard to detect for censors. The role of the state changed radically in free Baltic states. Media regulation now is very liberal, and ideas of liberal market dominate in its policies. However, the state is playing a fairly active role in imposing certain restrictions and media regulations. Development of culturally sensitive policies to protect the language, the country's cultural heritage, its folklore and national traditions. All these are perceived as fundamental role of the state alongside the policies to act in the name of a public interest. All three Baltic states have institutions of the so-called self-regulation, like ombudsman for the code of ethics or commissions of ethics for journalists and publishers. These institutions slightly depend on the authorities, but they are not directly influenced either by parliaments or governments. In other words, Baltic countries have a system of regulated self-regulation. The analytical dimension political parallelism refers to the relationship between the media and its environment. Specifically, it describes how the structure of the media system is aligned with the party system. In the early 90s, in the Baltic countries, the political parallelism was very strong for quite some years, culminating in explicit political parallelism, especially in 1992, and then gradually decreasing and disappearing by mid-90s. Especially in 1996, when we had our first law on provision of information to the public, with an added chapter telling that political press is kind of forbidden. On one hand, it was a strategic attempt to limit domination of certain parties and potential foreign, especially Russian interests. On the other hand, this restriction has weakened party system in Lithuania. And absence of direct political parallelism does not exclude political and ideological bias from our press. The bias can be observed in how news agenda is constructed, as well as via other more subtly and structurally defined elements, such as the placement of news in the newspapers, headline selection, how the news are framed, and what kind of background knowledge is given to readers. An important finding is that these ideological preferences are not explicated in the mission statements of editorial boards. They are not in flag lines, and therefore they are not transparent to an ordinary reader. Very well-known case with the proclamation of cause of independence showed, let's say, that part of our media supported Serbia, of course very small part, but very explicitly, while the rest of the media was in favor of independent Kosovo. In the other two Baltic countries, the situation is a bit different, since there are two media systems there in parallel, both in Latvia and Estonia. This situation is more controversial in Latvia, where the peculiarity of the Latvian media market is that it has been more clearly divided into two audience groups, Latvian and Russian speaking. These are not only two different audience groups, but also different journalism cultures, with Latvian being more compatible with principles of professional journalism and ideologically biased Russian journalism. Both in Latvia and Estonia, the duality of media markets is a historical outcome mostly seen as a result of the Soviet occupation. Ideological preferences bring us to the fourth analytical dimension of journalistic autonomy, that is, professional norms and mission to serve public. Research has shown that there is a good reason to be concerned about internal censorship and self-censorship nowadays in some of our news media. This is valid, again, for all three Baltic states. Some years ago, the report by Transparency International mentioned a case when a list of main advertisers was put on the notice board in the newsroom in one of our national TV channels, meaning that no negative material should be announced about them. Another research study reported on tendencies to abstain from criticism about main advertisers. The same study revealed that some newspapers published negative articles about some companies and in this way forced them to publish expensive advertisements. While in the Soviet times, censorship meant resignation in advance not to discuss specific issues in public, otherwise than in Azopian language. Today it means an adjustment of media to a particular situation which is comfortable financially. Danger for editorial independence comes from convergence of media and industry, finance and politics. Political and economical forces, while remaining anonymous, may and do interfere with editorial independence and autonomy in terms of setting out the agenda for the media. What is more important, the media is no longer a channel for spreading political ideas. It's no longer just a mediator between politicians and society. On the contrary, the media becomes the initiator of the politics, the so-called forced power. Our journalists were very fast to learn the trick that it's easy to kill a politician the same as a fly with a newspaper. In the Baltic countries, where political organizations are weak and fragmented, the definition of political issues and their interpretations is left to the media. In short, instead of being channel and mediator of political issues, the media becomes an active player in the field. Therefore, the understanding of the watchdog role is weak among our journalists, sorry to say. The main functions of journalism described by media professionals are ranging from just informing the public to serving audience interests. Thus, the control of the powerful is taken into account as much as it interests their readers or listeners. Consumerism and populism became everyday practice in both fields of politics and mass communication. To sum it up, low and decreasing public trust in parties, commercialization of the press and lack of its ideological diversity, lack of transparency in editorial choices, preferences of the audience for popular journalism and populism are reported in the Baltic states. Such situation contributes to an emerging crisis of values in these countries. And finally, the type of discourse is the most tangible dimension of journalistic culture. Discourse changed considerably during the last decade in printed press, radio, TV broadcasting, and of course in the internet. In late 80s and early 90s, a natural choice for press was to restitute what the nation has lost with the communism and to restore the old names of the newspapers of the First Republic, to get rid of the non-truths in the name of dailies, to abolish censorship and make up for the 50 years of silence, of forced silence. At that time, a lot of memoirs of previous political prisoners, of exiled people were published. Facts about political regime disclosed, forming the so-called sorrowful discourse. This type of discourse was combined with an attempt to import discourse types from abroad, specifically infotainment type of discourse, as well as some genres. The outcome was a very abrupt change in quality and quantity of printed press. A lot of Soviet time genres disappeared altogether. For example, heavily loaded editorials, detailed reports on the meetings of Communist Party of the Soviet Union, open letters from groups of workers to Communist Party leaders full of joy and enthusiasm that they live in the socialist country, portraits of winners of socialist competition, collective farmers and factory workers, news about successful fulfillment of 5-year work plans, and so on and so forth. But together with them, poetry and fiction that made a big part of the periodicals disappeared also. It was replaced by unbiased, or so to say, half unbiased news and free comments written by columnists, by investigative reporting of the type of Günther Wallraff role play called journalistic experiment. And well, the development of genres showed the change of our society. In some case, we lost something like the big reportage, specific genre that was very vivid in the Soviet period. It was replaced by the so-called feature, much more shallow, a totally different approach to narrative prose. Privatized periodicals introduced commercial advertisements that gradually increased in number to such an extent that they filled up 2/3 of a paper. Private media enterprises decreased the number of employees and refused to employ the so-called temporal non-staff members. Thus, there were less journalists and non-professional writers producing papers. Generic diversity and diversity in general decreased. It took just a few years for the hidden and implied advertising to appear in our press alongside with papers with explicitly commercial function. Thus, opinionated press appeared, and finally the type of discourse turned out to be more or less the same. We have, let's say in Lithuania, we have 324 magazines and journals, 11 dailies. They look diverse, especially if you take the visual part of them. Old Soviet newspapers were just gray with just 2 headlines and a few photos. All the place was filled in by letters. And now we have huge fragmentation, of course, technological development, but texts are short, they are cut into and divided by headlines, kickers, all kinds of attention grabbers, to such an extent that now we are talking about the death of a text, especially in internet. What comes of it is that now we are having seeming diversity, but actually more or less the same type of a discourse, especially when it comes to informational structure of a text. It's the same inverted pyramid. The most important things are given in the beginning, and the end could be cut if necessary to fit in the newspaper. I could go on talking about the contents, sensational, opinionated tabloid press, where negativism prevails, especially in headlines. But, well, that's a topic in itself, and I could give another lecture giving very specific examples of the change of our public sphere towards the colloquization and conventionalization of media. What I want to finish with is by saying that in the early 90s, in most post-communist countries, both systems, politics and media, had to be designed from scratch. This has been a crucial change, especially in the 3 Baltic states, which for the second time in the 20th century have reappeared on the European map. 2 decades later, the 3 Baltic countries are changing and still restructuring their states. But yet it's not completely clear into what. 20 years ago, mass media competed with the church for the most trusted institution. Nowadays, media takes the 9th place in the list. It is symptomatic that only 25% of Lithuanian population claim to support political pluralism and multi-party system. Only 50% would support market economy. The same amount of people believe that economical situation is much worse than 20 years ago, and for more than 80% think that flourishing economy is much more important than true democracy. Famous political leader of the reform movement, Sąjūdis, Vytautas Landsbergis, in his speech dedicated to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact that was kind of commemorated last week, he said that along the Baltic coast, a new invisible Berlin Wall is being built, leaving Baltic states on the side of Russia. He's always pessimistic, we know him. I believe that time will show whether he's right or not. But tendencies of changing journalistic cultures imply that new democracies need some support. New democracies, like teenagers, cannot be left to their own devices.
I think we'll take the questions at the end, actually. Thank you very much. Fascinating insight into one particular form of discourse in Eastern Europe, and also the insights, I think, into a part of the world, a region which many of us are not as familiar with as we probably should be. Thank you very much indeed. The second speaker is also, I think, going to investigate another kind of discourse that has very much to do with the musealization of culture, the way of memorializing cultures through the process of creating museums, redesigning museums, conceptualizing memory. I'd like to just introduce him with a few words. Professor Piotr Piotrowski is Professor of Art History at the University of Poznan in Poland and also Director of the National Museum of Art in Warsaw. He's a major international scholar of modern art, in particular the relationship of art and politics. He's been visiting professor in the United States, in Israel, in Hungary, and in Germany. Excuse me. And of his many publications, I'd just like to mention one entitled In the Shadow of Yalta, Art and the Avant-Garde in Eastern Europe, 1945 to 1989, which has just appeared in its English edition this year. And tonight he's going to speak to us on the changing roles of museums in Eastern Europe since the fall of communism, how changing presence changes not only future, of course, but also the way we narrate and conceptualize the past as well. And once again, I'd ask you to give him a warm welcome to Dublin.
Thank you very much for inviting me here and introduction. Before I start, what I'd like to tell you about the museums. Let me have a sort of comments about the introduction at the beginning. Of course, we do not have just one 1989. In every country in Eastern Europe, 1989, the conclusions, the fact is different because the background was different. There was no one Eastern Europe. There were many Eastern Europes, and I remember when I been at the beginning when I started to traveling in the West, I was so upset about this. That the people in the West thought that this is one model of Eastern Europe. That is not true. So if the background is different, the conclusions, the results of 1989 are also quite different. So this is the first introductory remarks. But the second one, of course, 1989, as you said in the beginning, is not only important for Eastern Europe. It's this is the date, I guess, very important for the whole world, and including the West. Right now, I'm in the project, the scholarly project, which is a series of seminars and congresses or conferences, as well as there will be, the end of this project will be the exhibition, which is called The Former West. The Former West, of course, is rooted in 1989. And definitely the world is completely different right now. The Western world is completely different right now than before. And I would say that the problem of these changes should be seen in the perspective of the so-called deprovincialization of the West. This, of course, comes from Chakrabarty books, Provincializing Europe, which is one of the key books in the post-colonial studies, but it's not the question of Europe, but it's the question of the West. It means that the West is, or is going to be, one of the provinces and should be seen as such. And this is, I think, the effect of the 1989. There are many, of course, more, but this is one of maybe the crucial. Coming back to the museums. We used to say that the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is the century of the museums. The museum effect is one of the great impact shaping the global culture. And many scholars, among others, Walter Glucksman from Germany, used to say that the museum is the most successful global institution. However, the other scholar, also from Germany, Hans Belting, is one of the leading art historians in Germany, pointed out that the museum is not only global, but is, first of all, the local. So sometimes we used to say that, this is the global institution, but this locality of the museum is very important because the audience is mostly from the place, the local audience. The money, along with the international money, the global money, of course, coming mostly from the place. And the authorities, the relationships, both the public and the private, are mostly local as well. So this is very important to our consideration if we would like to speak about the museums after 1989 in Eastern Europe, or former Eastern Europe, let's say. I'm running the museum, what is called in the museum studies, the Universal Survey Museum. The National Museum in Warsaw is the biggest museum in Poland. Is the art museum, actually. There's not a historical museum, but it is, I would say, the National Museum of Art. But I would be talking about the very particular museums as Museum of Contemporary Art, MOCAS. MOCA, Museum of Contemporary Art, is a very popular institution. It's this typical global institution, since contemporary art is mostly global. So I was talking about three museums, three MOCAs, let's say, three museums of contemporary art. First in Bucharest, Romania. The second one in Kubu, in Tallinn, Estonia. And the third one, the museum in progress, still having temporary space, the Museum of Contemporary Art, or Modern Art. It's called Modern Art, but it's actually Contemporary Art in Warsaw. So that will be three institutions. Of course, Eastern Europe has pretty interesting tradition in, let's say, so-called the Museum of Modern Art. You might know that the third museum in chronology of Museum of Modern Art is in Łódź, in Poland. The first was MoMA in New York City, founded in 1929. The second one was the Modern Art Collection, the Landesmuseum in Hanover, Germany. And the third one is in Łódź, which was very interesting because the beginning of this museum was a donation of the artists, Polish constructivism, who collected contemporary art from the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, and donated to the city. So there's the third museum of contemporary art in the region. But also in Yugoslavia, we have very interesting stories, post-war actually stories about this. There was the Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb. Now, last week, they opened a new building, and also in Belgrade. I'd like to, since we are talking about 1989, so the most important point of reference, I mean, there will be actually 2 points of reference, but one of them is the past, and I'll be considering, I try to answer the question how the past is influenced the Museum of Contemporary Art in Eastern Europe. If we agree maybe this is the problematic. If we agree that the past was traumatic, we have two approaches to the past, traumaphilic and traumaphobic. Just let me leave aside the theoretical discourse which is behind this vocabulary, traumaphilic and traumaphobic. But if trauma is behind, if trauma is behind, if trauma is a history of the region, so we have two, generally speaking, approaches to this, traumaphilic and traumaphobic. Traumaphobia is something which is just suppress trauma and at the same time the past. And traumaphilia is something as overworking the past. So that will be the first point of reference. The second point of reference is the place where exactly these three museums are located and how this location, and the same as well as the past, are related to what they are going to show in their own program. All right, first museum. First, this is the Museum of Contemporary Art. The full name is the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest. It's located, it's a gigantic building in Bucharest, the third building in terms of space in the world. The biggest one is Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The second one is the TV headquarters in Beijing, constructed just before the Olympic Games. So this is the third one. You might know the story, the whole story about this. Very interesting, described and analyzed by Renata Salazar from Slovenia in the Lacanian perspective. What she is trying to say that Ceausescu wanted to create something ex nihilo. So this is the Lacanian term, but he destroyed like 40% of the old city, 26 churches and so on and so on and so on, and constructed a gigantic building, you see on the top, and the huge axis going towards this building. This is multifunctional building right now. This is the parliament, this is the parliament house, and also in terms of former East European museums, pretty big space for the museum, but of course in terms of the whole space is not so much. This is the on the bottom you see the entrance to the museum, which is on the other side of this building. So the Museum of Contemporary Art is located in the very symbolical place as the Palace of the People is called, as the Palace of the People, is in Bucharest. This is the symbol of communism in Romania. So now we have to just think a little bit. What does it mean? What does it mean that if the Museum of Contemporary Art is located in such a building? How history is inflected the program of this museum? And the answer is not so much. The museum does not care about history. Maybe not at all, but basically. They have some exhibitions of very little about Romanian historical art, particularly independent, but mostly they're trying to construct, to establish a museum of global art. There are many exhibitions about contemporary art from Germany, the Netherlands, the US, Western Europe, Asia, like China and Japan and so on. There will be the list of this program. The exhibition is pretty striking, and you can just check it on the web page. So I would call this museum quite traumaphobic museum, even if it is located even is located in the building, Ceausescu's building, but it does not want to have anything with historical past, which is really traumatic. You might know that Romania was in a pretty tough situation under Ceausescu's regime. Of course, Ceausescu at the beginning, in the middle of the 1960s, appeared as a liberal, but after a couple of years, it's, appeared as a dictator. So there was a very severe regime, maybe the most severe regime in Eastern Europe. So this building is a symbol of this past. So they use this building, but they do not want to do anything with the past. And this is really traumaphobic approach. The second one I'd like to show you, Tallinn, Kumu. Kumu means Kunstmuseum, Museum of Art. And this is the new building, completely new, in the park, outside the small city, rather, Tallinn is. And this is a completely new building, very nice, designed by the Finnish, I guess, architect. So in terms of building, in terms of location, it has nothing to do with history. But the curator of the permanent exhibition, Eha Komisarov, decided to include in the permanent exhibition social Israelism. Social Israelism has been considered in Estonia, in other countries, particularly republics like Lithuania as well, as the art of the occupants, as the art of the Soviets. But nevertheless, Eha Komisarov decided to include this art in the permanent exhibition, seen as a point of reference, both of the independent art during, particularly 1970s, Tallinn, or Estonia actually, was a very important place in the entire Soviet Union in terms of the independent art. There was actually two cities where the independent art, particularly conceptual art, is a part of the neo-avant-garde, has been shown. It was, of course, unofficially, Moscow and Tallinn. So that is a very important. So she said that we have to show this art first in order to understand what kind of art we have as the independent art, and in terms to refer to contemporary situation. I would call this as traumaphilic approach to the past. So we have right now Romania, Bucharest, Mnag, National Museum of Contemporary Art, as traumaphobic approach to the past, and Kumu in Tallinn as quite traumaphilic. And the third one, and the last one, I'd like to tell you something about Warsaw. So the museum in Warsaw is still in progress. It has a temporary space and shows some exhibitions in temporary space, but still waiting, and the process is ongoing. The process to construct this building is going, and perhaps will be completed to 2014 or 2015. But the situation in Warsaw is much more complex, as the history, was much complex. There was the whole history, particularly history of art, was much more complicated than in Romania or in Estonia. What was considered as an unofficial art in Estonia and Romania, in Poland, particularly after 1956, was considered as an official art. The neo-avant-garde and modern art was considered as a quite, legal, official, whatever art. So this is why the situation is much more complex, and maybe the binary relationship, traumaphobia, traumaphilia, is very complex issue. And let me read at the end a small analysis of this. What you see, this is the first prize in the competition, international competition of the museum. This is Christian Keres from Switzerland, who won this competition. So the museum is planned to be built just in the front of the Palace of Culture. You see the Palace of Culture? What is the pointer with here? Oh, this is the Palace of Culture, and there will be the museum. This is like the so-called Warsaw Manhattan. So not all buildings are already constructed, but there are some. So this is the idea to erase the significance of this building, Palace of Culture, which was a sort of a gift of Stalin. Actually, constructed when Stalin died, but doesn't matter. It's typical Soviet architecture, and then they wanted to erase the significance of this building and to build skyscrapers over here. So some of them are already done, some not. But frankly speaking, I see from my office this building, Palace of Culture, looks pretty strong. And so this is the irony of history. This contemporary architecture, it's a little bit weak, and in the competition of Palace of Culture. So anyway, so there will be the Museum of Contemporary Art, and there will be the next building, which is not decided what kind. Right? There will be the competition, the architectural competition, maybe in next year, maybe 2 years. So this is the process what the city is trying to develop. So the museum is planned to be built just in the front of the Palace of Culture, on the one hand, and the socialist modernist architecture of the two streets, Świętokrzyska and Marszałkowska, on the other. So this is one street, and this is the one street. This is a typical socialist modernism from the 60s and 70s. Very bad, I would say, architecture. And so this is one, and the second is over here. So this building rather is in the relationship on the Stalinist architecture and the so-called socialist modernist architecture. Originally, that is when the architectural competition has been actually twice introduced, the museum building has to be counterbalanced with the surrounding architecture, particularly to the Stalinist Palace of Culture and Science, in order to erase the significant position in urban planning of the latter. Celebrating the decision to construct the museum, which has been publicly announced in the place exactly where it will be sited, the lights in the nearby Palace of Culture have been switched off. That was the symbolical gesture. There was a symbolical gesture saying that new culture, this contemporary art, housed by new contemporary architecture, would be able to challenge the historical meaning of this era and to replace the culture symbolized by the Stalinist palace by that of the museum, that is, new, international, and modern. In that matter of fact, the international jury chose Christian Keres' project. You see, let me go. No, this is the Palace of Culture. Actually, you see, this is the picture from the beginning of the 90s. Oh, sorry. There's a different story, I will explain it. Sorry. So, after very severe public discussion about this architectural design and being under the pressure brought by the press and the city and state authorities, the director of the museum in progress, Tadeusz Zielewicz, who had rejected such a decision about this project, finally resigned. The same did the board of advisors and some members of the board of trustees. Actually, at least some of them had something like a favorable project on the competition. That is actually this favorable project from the former director. According to him, it would compete the Palace of Culture, the Stalinist architecture. This won a special prize in this architectural competition. And according to them, it could compete the Palace of Culture. In terms of architecture, thus, the meaning of the project which won the competition, This is the interior of this special prize. So in terms of architecture, the meaning of the project which won the competition is clear. It is definitely not competing surrounding urban planning and architecture. Neither socialist modernist nor the socialist realist architecture of the Stalinist palace. In terms of historical trauma embodied in the communist architecture around, Keres's project means neither suppressing nor overworking. So there is no trauma-philic, no trauma-phobic at the same time. However, it's also not a repetition, rather a correspondence. It is seen particularly if you consider the L shape. This is the L shape, like this one. If you consider the L shape of the whole building, which has been done according to the decision of the Warsaw City Council, trying to harmonize the whole area. In one word, it's neither traumaphobia nor traumaphilia. However, paradoxically, it does exactly fit in the character of Polish memory of communism. To explain this, let us try to analyze the premises of the future collection. There will be the collection is the museum. This is the point. Let me stress that it looks like the contemporary starts 1989, the year when communism collapsed. What was before is historical. What has been done after is the present day. If the museum would keep this date as the radical, sharp point of reference, we could say that this is the quite trauma-phobic approach. However, it's not. It was decided to add to the collection of contemporary art since 1989, art production from the previous decades, starting from 1960s. That is, from the so-called post-Thaw period, identified mostly with the neo-avant-garde movements. This is the core of our discussion. Since Polish neo-avant-garde art, I'm talking about the 60s and 70s, used to be seen not as a victim of communism, as in many Eastern countries, like Lithuania, Estonia, Soviet Union, Romania, and so on, called this communists called very often actual or real existing socialists, rather than as something going with it. This art production was somehow polemical to the system, but definitely was not radical critique. Particularly, it did not make its critique in the direct way. I'm talking about Polish New Avant-Garde. In its majority, it was definitely not traumatic. Rather, as I've said before, sometimes joyful. You might know that there is a quite different historical point of departure from that in Romania on the one hand and Estonia on the other. Socialist rise was ended in Poland in 1956, while in Romania, as well as in the Soviet republics, as Estonia, for example, and Lithuania as well, it has been the official doctrine up till the end of communism, that is 1989. Therefore, to collect historical art means something different in Poland than in other countries of the Eastern Bloc, except of Yugoslavia. This is the different case. In one word, it is not trauma-philic. Of course, I'm not going to say that Poland, Polish artists in particular, were free under communism. It was still a sort of prison, even if it was the velvet prison. If the Poles would enjoy the system entirely, they did not fight with it. The result of, among others, such a long-lasting opposition was 1989, which is the topic of our session. And this is also the crucial here. It is not only because that was the turning point from the past to the contemporary, as it has been mentioned before, but also for the geographical interest of the museum. This is very important too. What kind of art, not only in terms of history, but geography, the Warsaw Museum would like to collect. The Warsaw Museum of Modern Art, or Contemporary Art, in terms of both the collection as well as the exhibition program, will be much more interested in Central European art, of course not only, than that in Bucharest and Tallinn at the same time. Maybe I'm wrong, but I did not find any statements concerning such an interest in the case of the latters. Here in Warsaw, this prospect of the future activities is quite visible. For example, as I told you, they have temporary space. So in this temporary space, they had a couple of exhibitions showing their interest in in the East, former East. So the exhibition of Yugoslavian art in 2008, or the conference 1968-1989, at the same year. Also Ion Grigorescu's exhibition from Romania, one of the leading Romanian new avant-garde artists, unofficial, the underground artists in the same year as well. All of them held in the museum temporary space. Of course, not only, they have more exhibitions in this small space. It means that if such a project would succeed, the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw could house the third collection of Central European art after Moderna Galeria in Ljubljana, which was funded in 2000, and the Erste Bank in Vienna, which this collection, the second collection, was funded 2006, the private collection, but the bank collection, and the third one is the public one. Stressing its geohistorical interest, the museum would like to point the leading position of Poland in the whole historical process of rejecting communism, as Poland is claiming, also on the official political discourse. Poland is claiming that Poland, this country, was the leading country in terms of changing in East Europe. As we have seen, the Warsaw Museum of Modern Art Architecture is going together with the premises of the collecting program. Neither of them is traumaphobic or traumaphilic. It reveals a soft passage from communism to post-communism Poland, 1989. Since communism for the Poles was not so much traumatic, at least not in the same way as to the other people from the Eastern Bloc, including particularly Romania and Estonia. The collective memory of the past in this country, to which a history of art belongs, because I'm talking not of the everyday experience, but the art historical experience, is not so much traumatic either. If we can speak on the trauma here, it is rather the trauma of big change, the beginning of the 90s, or the trauma of the transitional period, which a huge wave of poverty and unemployment emerged as a result of the neoliberal policy of the 1990s, rather than on the so-called past period. You know, that's in Poland before unification to the EU, yes, that's, you know, this half page, was 20% of unemployment. The unification with the EU helped people, you know, to seek jobs, among others, here in this country and this city as well. Conclusions. East European communism was a very claustrophobic system. People used not to be allowed to travel free, that is, used not to be allowed to participate in the world art scene, at least not fully and freely. Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania was a particularly severe prison for the whole nation. Now, when Romania is a free country and the EU member, such an interest in the global art scene is a quite understandable reaction to the past. If, however, such an interest fulfills almost the entire program, and if it is not accompanied with a critical approach to the past, as one would expect in such a place, it's indeed a symptom of traumaphobia. On the other hand, we have a former Soviet Republic, Estonia, which regained the independence at the very beginning of the 1990s, which is the member of the EU too. However, since during the communist time, it even had no its national or state independence. It is seeking for its sort of historical identity, for fulfilling a historical gap between one independent state up to the beginning of the 1940s and the present day one. Some sort of traumaphilia seems to be very useful for them, since, as Dominique Lacapra, famous historian, said, it helped to avoid the discourse of absence, to avoid a state of disorientation, even confusion, and at the same time to create historical memory necessary to build national identity. Poland is in a very particular situation, since the definition of the past in terms of the trauma is not so obvious, or sometimes even questioned in both political and everyday life discourse. The dialectics traumaphilia, traumaphobia seems to be less useful, at least not in a direct way. However, as we have seen, both from the architectural as well as program point of view, Warsaw Museum of Modern Art deals very much with the specificity of the collective memory, including, let's say, art historical memory too. Very unique, very unique comparison if we compare with the other Eastern Bloc countries, at least Romania and Estonia. Thank you very much, and sorry for extending the time.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's a very important further contribution to the process we've been trying to engage with tonight, to do with differentiating the monolithic idea of Eastern Europe that is quite widespread outside Eastern Europe. So thank you very much. I'd like to move straight on to our third speaker now, is Dr. Tomasz Kabusela, who's Thomas Brown Lecturer in Polish Studies at Trinity College and also has a post at the University of Opole in Poland. He's an expert in the relationship of language politics, and national identity in Eastern Europe. He's edited volumes on nationalism. He's series editor of a series called Nationalisms Across the Globe. And his most recent book is The Politics of Language and Nationalisms in Modern Central Europe, published this year by Palgrave. And this, I think, is his theme tonight, the links between language, politics and nationalism in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe or Eastern Europe more generally? Eastern Europe, since 1989. Don't answer that one at the moment. So again, please welcome me in joining Thomas. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Kabusela.
Thank you very much for the welcome, and I won't be going into the question what is Eastern and Central Europe because, well, it would be another topic, truly speaking, and you cannot talk about everything in one lecture, obviously. I would like to talk about the continued importance of language as the basis for building nation states and legitimizing national statehood in Eastern Central Europe, more or less in this region. And the importance of the political importance of language as such developed in the region in the 19th century, and it became the basis, ideological basis for establishing nation states in the 20th century. I do not want to say that languages are not ideological or not important in other parts of the world, but I dare say and put such a thesis that languages are quite more important from the ideological point of view in Eastern Central Europe than elsewhere. And trying to focus on this kind of transition point from communism into this post-communist era in which we live today, I suppose this transition point underscores the importance of language as the instrument of nation-state building or state destroying, you could say. And when in 1989 communism finished, it was followed in 1991 by the breakup of the Soviet Union's breakup took place alongside ethno-linguistic lines of the Union Republics. So actually, these national Union Republics became successor nation states, ethno-linguistic nation states today after the end of the Soviet Union. Then in 93 there was the breakup of Czechoslovakia into the Czech and Slovak nation states. And most importantly, in the 90s, from the 90s until almost today, there was a protracted breakup of Yugoslavia, and this breakup of Yugoslavia was paralleled by the breakup of the Serbo-Croatian language into Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian. So it shows that somehow languages are still important, truly speaking. And I wanted to problematize with my research, which probably in the future will be in the form of an atlas of language politics in modern Central Europe, try to problematize how actually languages are important. So basically, social scientists believe language usually to be an entity and concrete object which doesn't require any further analysis. Well, linguists know that it is not such, that languages are constructs, but they are more interested in analyzing languages as they are now, basically, and they do not very often go into the probing of the social and political aspects of language construction. So, in a way, drawing a parallel from the study of nationalism and ethnicity, you could say that languages are as imagined and as constructed as nations, which is especially true in Central and Eastern Europe. And here I can show you some instruments which are used for constructing languages, you know, like script. Here we have a Lithuanian book printed with the use of the Cyrillic script. Here we have the Lithuanian book printed with the use of the Latin script, but with the use of the Polish spelling, and now Lithuanian is printed a bit differently. Here we have the example of the first authoritative and standardizing dictionary of the Latvian language. It's telling to see that it was a German Latvian language, so it was kind of German Latvian dictionary, so it was a bilingual authoritative dictionary. And here we have something new, which is the school grammar of the Bosnian language, introduced recently in the schools in Bosnia. And here we have something older from this region, from the 1920s. There is a book in Slavic, today we would say retroactively and probably committing the error of anachronism in the Bosnian language, but printed with the use of the Arabic script. And I'm saying that Central Europe and, well, in our thinking maybe Eastern Europe, language is used very intensively for nation building and state building as it is not somewhere else. And basically language is the basis of nation building and defines what a nation is, as it later on, when such a nation comes into being, also defines what its nation state should be. And now I'm going to show how I'm problematizing actually the importance of language, because before such languages, written languages, constructed languages, languages defined through grammar, through script, become a reality, there is also a certain linguistic reality before them, and it is the reality of dialects or dialect continua. Basically, dialects before written languages, standardized languages come into being, changed from place to place. And in this way, certain dialectal continua come into being. You could say that, let's say, dialect of your village is very similar to the adjacent village, and then it's more in a village like 50 kilometers away from your village, it's a bit different, but it's still kind of mutually intelligible. And even the furthest dialect from yours, it's somehow still mutually intelligible. So there is a change within this area of dialect continuum, which creates dialect chains. And I wanted to have a look how this dialect continua looked like. And I did it through history, but for the last 1,000 years in Central Europe, but here I'm showing the maps for the last 100 years. So this kind of red areas is the Germanic dialect continuum. This pale green area, it is the North Slavic dialect continuum. This darker green area, South Slavic dialect continuum. And here, this pale brown area is the East Romance Dialect Continuum. Here we have West Romance Dialect Continuum, Turkey Dialect Continuum, and so on. And I did a bit of this kind of lines are representing here the dispersed Germanic dialect continuum, which corresponds to Yiddish-speaking Jews. And another kind of lines corresponds to the Indic-speaking Roma people. So this picture is quite complex, and the dialect continua are overlapping, and what happens to them when nation states are being built on the basis of languages, in such an understanding that each nation state should have only one national language and other languages shouldn't be spoken over there. Obviously, such an approach to state building with the use of language as the ideological basis and the basis for statehood legitimization wants to change, overhaul this idea, this linguistic reality of dialect continua. And there is another map of what the linguistic continua are today. Well, they almost perfectly coincide with the borders of nation states as they exist today in Central Europe. The only exception is this kind of dispersed dialect continuum of the Indic-speaking Roma people. Just for the illustration, here how it looked like before the rise of ethno-linguistically based nation states, the dialect continua, and here how they look today. Well, because I was saying that the basic instrument for the creation of standard national languages is writing. Writing is being done with the use of certain scripts. And the scripts are not, as we are prone to think today, kind of ideologically neutral. All the scripts which we are using them because of some decisions which were taken on certain basis, maybe not consciously, but by our predecessors. So you could briefly say that the Latin script is connected very strongly to Catholicism. Cyrillic is connected very strongly to Slavic Orthodox Christianity. The Greek script is connected to the Orthodox religion, and the Arabic script obviously is connected to Islam. And in the past, there were many different kinds of scripts used across the width and breadth of Central and Eastern Europe, but today we have just 3. And the brown area, it is the area of the use of the Latin script. The green area is the area of the use of Cyrillic, and this yellow area is the area of the use of the Greek script. Actually, the 3 scripts are also the 3 official scripts of the European Union today. Here you have all kinds of lines, and obviously you cannot very well read the legend for the map, but they represent the maximum extent of the current 3 scripts used in this part of Europe today, and also of other scripts which are not used anymore, like the Arabic script or Hebrew script. Well, I was also trying to problematize the concept of ethno-linguistic nationalism. What accounts for its dynamics, and I came up with such the idea that this overlapping of spatial and ideological overlapping of language, nation, and state can be somehow conceptualized and then operationalized and used to draw further series of maps. So I ask myself the question, what actually ethno-linguistic nationalism wants to achieve as statehood and nationhood building ideology? And it's pretty simple, because they define the ethno-linguistic nationalists, nations in the linguistic terms, saying that all the speakers of something which is defined as a language are members of a nation. And then the territory inhabited by the speakers of such a language should be made into in such a nation state. And thirdly, but quite importantly, the national language of such a nation state and such a and the nation cannot be shared with other polities or nations. And I tried to see how this overlapping of language, nation and state was achieved through the 20th century history of Central and Eastern Europe. And here at this map I'm presenting how this overlapping was achieved during the communist period. Basically, the states marked in bright colors are those which achieved this overlapping. So Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, in a way Czechoslovakia, and let me see, and the Baltic states and so on. And it is, as I see, not in the communist period, it is in the interwar period. And also Greece, Albania and Turkey. Then, during the communist period, when the ideology of communists was competing with the ideology of ethno-linguistic nationalists, actually the number of the states which were fulfilling the conditions of this overlapping of language, nation and state fell down. And here we have Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, basically, and that's it. And when we come to the period to today, the number of the states fulfilling this overlapping actually jumped up again, and we have quite many of them. And you can see it graphically once again, like it is in 1930, it is in the communist period, and it is today. And if you want to look at this statistically, you can calculate that in 1930 there were 12 states which were fulfilling this ethno-linguistic overlapping, the principle of ethno-linguistic overlapping of language, nation and state. In the late communist period only 5, and in 2009 we have 13 again. So language, we are usually led to believe by our everyday experience is something intangible, something used for communication, and we do not see very often its political importance. But however, if we look at history of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century, we can see and we can notice that language was put to many hard uses, like assimilation, like expulsion, like in many cases genocide. So this idea how to achieve this ethno-linguistic homogeneity in this aspiring ethno-linguistic nation states led to all these quote-unquote hard uses of language. And now we are left with Central Europe, where the linguistic variety is waning in a way. But today in the European Union there is quite a lot of lip service, mostly paid to upholding linguistic variety. And let's say some programs are in place, and linguistic variety is kind of praised, but basically it depends on us if the linguistic variety should be important or shouldn't be important. And there are obviously no answers, clear answers, what should be important for us. The answers must come from all of us as citizens of the European Union. And here there is a map showing the still surviving linguistic variety in Central and Eastern Europe. There are, once again, here you have the dialectal continuum marked, and you have small numbers and letters which are representing minority, unrecognized or languages. And there are plenty of them, but the use of them is kind of shrinking, and it is attested mostly in many cases among older generations only. And the last thing, you have the listing of these languages showing the names of them. So here you have the map, and here there is the legend. Simply there was actually no space to put the names on the map, which was my first idea what to do. So it was a very brief run through the maps, and probably the Long Room Hub will have them displayed in the new building, so we'll be able to have a leisurely look at them if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Could I ask the speakers to join us on the platform? We have about 10-15 minutes for questions and discussions. As it's a relatively short time, I'm going to throw, invite questions straight away if anyone would like to leap in. Steve, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask the first speaker about the comment that you made at the end of your speech about the percentage of the number of people who felt that things were better off or worse off in the new regime. And it struck me that asking people today, by contrast with 2 years ago, you might get a different response. So I wondered if that would be true. And then the second question, I was wondering about the representation of women and the role of women since 1989 in Lithuania. For example, whether you saw a reduction in the value of women as people as opposed to symbols, and whether that was represented in the press, in terms of how women were represented in the press.
Okay, thanks. Talking about the public poll that I used for this presentation, yes, of course, it can be, and it is influenced by the economical recession of the moment. But similar polls were described some time ago, and the tendency towards remembering past times as best times is very clear-cut. Maybe it's due to the type of memory we have, that we tend to remember old days in better colors than nowadays, and not only because of that. Lithuania is the first nation in EU on the rate of emigration. Poland in absolute numbers, and Lithuania in relative numbers. We lost something like 500,000, and for a nation of 3 million people, that's a lot. So every family has members abroad. Today I was greeted Labas Rytas in the hotel by a Lithuanian student working there. So they say that Lithuanian, like sparrows, are all over the world, and we start talking not about nations that are kind of compactly living and talking their languages in specific territories, but diaspora nations that they are everywhere more or less forming diasporas. And talking about the role of women, in general, Lithuania is a matrimotic country, I'd like to say, and role of women is important. At the moment we have female president, female parliament speaker, quite a few ministers, so women are gaining power, although they had it before. From the symbolism, symbolic, especially from media, it's changing. And one of my students had has a very interesting topic to compare how the International Women's Day was described in Soviet period and actually all over the 20 years and before that. So it's changing in the direction that it's more true to life. In the Soviet period, women were kind of honored on that day, and the main ethos of the discourse was that you have to combine, you have to work and to take care of your family, but to be visible on very special occasions. And on these occasions there were pictures of female tractor drivers, female road makers, actually these that had masculine professions. Then there was a shift towards femininity. Yes, all those, you know, hard to describe, but Hollywood type women that prevailed in our press. Entertaining role of a woman. Nowadays it's more or less in balance. We do not have anything like fierce feminism, but we do not have anything like it used to be in the Soviet period, that you have to be a career woman in order to be appreciated in that society, if I answered your question.
May I continue? Just,
Sure, then we'll bring somebody else.
Question
Please, yes.
do you have in your law the quota of women, being represented in the national parliament and other institutions? Do you have something like this or not?
No, and actually, personally me, I'm always kind of unhappy when I find out that my presence was maybe, I am never sure, but forced by some attempts to have more women. No, it's not popular with us.
Do you consider that those people, the women, who are on the top of the politics, they are representing the women's issue in the politics or not? Being a woman in the politics is not necessary, to be, for the women's issue in the public life. How do you consider this?
Well, I think that these women that are high in the hierarchy now, they simply deserve it because they are very good professionals. But not because, it used to be in the Soviet period that if medals had to be distributed, so we had to have some percentage of males and females, were intelligentsia and workers, and of course Lithuanians and Russians. And it was very hard. If you have to give out some 30 medals, the clear-cut proportions were like that. But remembering that, it's in our memory, we try to get rid of it. It's not that we don't have any laws, and of course there are European requirements. When we have projects, we have to somehow observe the roles of men and women in the project. But no.
Thank you. There's a question in the front, then one at the back. Please.
Yeah, I have a question to all three speakers, so I'll try and make it really brief. To the first speaker on the Baltic states, you mentioned biographies. Did you find in the early 1990s the appearance of conversion narratives, so to speak, from communism to democracy, kind of like a religious kind of thing, where you justify what you previously did to maybe create a role for yourself in the new post-1989 society? And the second speaker, just beyond modern art, I wanted to ask a question on generally in museums and the portrayal of pre-1989 in museums. Do you find a growing trend, perhaps in Poland, like you would have in East Germany now, of nostalgia or of Ostalgie in Germany, where you have a commercialization of the pre-1989 past, like you have with the implementing the little traffic light man. And I wanted to ask the role museums maybe perhaps could play in that particular pattern. And to the last speaker, you very much made the link between languages and nation states, and I wanted to ask about the role of communism as an ideology, which maybe transcends traditional nation state by creating new terms and new words that perhaps didn't exist, and maybe try to create commonalities between different communist states before 1989.
Thank you. Could I suggest we take those in reverse order so everyone gets a chance to say something? If you're ready. Yeah.
Well, communists actually didn't contest ethno-linguistic nationalism heads-on, because, let's say, when the Fisher lines appeared in interwar Yugoslavia, because in interwar Yugoslavia, the non-existent Serbo-Croatian, the Serbo-Croato-Slovenian language was made into the official language for the Yugoslav nation. So it was the Yugoslav language, Yugoslav nation. The Slovenian Croats had problems with that and took issue, and especially it became visible during the war when Yugoslavia was recreated as a communist state. It was recreated on this kind of Soviet model as consisting from the ethno-linguistic, ethno-national republic, you could say, with the separate languages. And this model was the model on which the Soviet Union was built. And actually the Soviet Union, in the person of Stalin, who was on this kind of research trip in 1912 in Austro-Hungary, when Lenin noticed that communists wouldn't win the heart of workers, that actually they were siding with the nationally or ethno-linguistically defined nations and national groups. So Stalin went to Austro-Hungary and studied the system over there, how nationalism was co-opted for the state system of Austro-Hungary, and then it was transferred to the Soviet Union. So in a way, communists wanted to co-opt nationalism in order to have states bigger than ethno-linguistic nation states. And the thinking was that in the future, nationalism would disappear, would become less important, and communists would win. Actually, it turned the other way around, because nationalism, ethno-linguistic nationalism destroyed the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia.
Thank you.
Me?
Yes, please.
Small anecdote, the question of language. When I was many times, once in Zagreb, I saw in TV, in Croatian TV, sort of movie, Serbian movie with subtitles. It was so crazy because it's the same language. It's the subtitles. Everyone, particularly in the age after 20, could understand the other language. At the same time, I was also completely surprised when I was in Brno, giving a lecture at the University of Brno, in Brno, the Czech Republic. And the guy who invited me to this to the lecture told me that the young generation has the difficulties to understand Slovak language, which is middle of the way between Polish and Czech. So this is the real issue. This is the real political issue, I guess. I'm trying to answer to your question. This is a pretty complex question. Of course, on the level of commercial usage of the symbol of former Soviet Union and communism, different countries trying on the political level trying to manage this in different ways. For example, in Poland right now, the right-wing politicians would like to ban the whole usage of communism. There's a huge discussion about this, trying to to make the equal position between the Nazi one, the Nazi Hakenkreuz, and the Soviet one. But
in terms of art, I would say there are two different approaches to the heritage of the visuality of the Soviet Union or the communism. The one is something what I call gadgetization of Soviet symbols, particularly important in the Soviet art, the Russian art rather, the Russian art in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, when Russia opened its borders to the Western art market. The first Sotheby auction was 1988, something like this. And the young artists, which came from the soc art, so-called soc art, mostly from Moscow, who realized that this is a big business. Soc art meant that they used the symbols of the Soviet Union in terms of the critical approach, not as a gadget, but the critical approach. As pop art in the United States used the symbols of the mass culture, consumer culture, in order to investigate, to make a critical approach to the mass culture, like Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, something like this. But they realized that this is a big business. So there was a huge wave of gadgetization, like in the commercial use, gadgetization of the Soviet symbols. So the second approach would be, particularly the former Yugoslavia artists in Slovenia, like Irving Group, but also in some artists in Serbia, which wanted to investigate the memory and the memory of the totalitarian symbol in contemporary art, and try to make a sort of critical space between the symbol and the let's say the approach to ideology or history or something that is like not as Stilinovic, for example, from actually not Serbia but Croatia. So there are different approaches to this, which are rather not shown, will be very hard to find in the other countries like Poland, like Czech Republic or Slovakia. But the third, something connected what you said about nostalgia in former GDR. Well, I saw the exhibition many years ago in the late 90s in Deutsches Historisches Museum, so-called Zeughaus in Berlin, Bohème und Diktatur. And that was a pretty interesting exhibition because it showed the unofficial cultural, not only art, but cultural life in the former Soviet, in the former East Germany, using fashion, for example, showing how people used to use fashion in order to express their own approaches and to the writing. But not the exhibition itself, but the reception of this exhibition has had pretty much to do with the nostalgia. So this is, I think, a pretty complex issue, so this is a very unique and very particular in terms of former East Germany, particular reception, and there are some people who would like to play a sort of game with the past.
Thank you.
And now I want to come back, if I remember correctly, you were asking about the change of discourse and biographies, yes, that appeared at that time, yeah? So the essence of the question was if it was a sharp change or?
If there was a pattern that developed in terms of an art, another post 1989 in East Germany, or particularly in East Germany, there was this kind of sense of a conversion narrative of, justifying a particular role you may have had pre-1989 and reinventing yourself post 1989 in a new kind of in a new situation. Was there a similar pattern? Was there this kind of everyone wanted to publish their autobiography in order to justify themselves, or?
Yes, it was. And there was a boom of newspapers that appeared once or twice, depending on the money they had. And most of them were just stories about partisans in the woods, or just people had to tell the word of truth at that time. And all those small newspapers, they looked funny, they were very shabby, but they were so sincere with authentic stories and photos, they disappeared in a year.
But that was a very interesting period, and now we try to get back and to see what happened. And we are kind of surprised to see that 1 or 2 years was enough for people to tell their stories. And then they were put in the books, and that's it.
Thank you.
Just one sentence. There's a very interesting artist in Lithuania, Markevicius, who is dealing with the past, with the biography. And he made a film, very interesting film, showing the people who work in the factories right now closed, how they memorize the old history in this factory. There was the meters factory, something, gas meters factory, something like this. Very interesting story, contradictory to the official approach to the past.
Please, gentlemen at the back.
Sorry, just like to ask the panel, please. I was doing a grand tour around Croatia and Bosnia 2 years ago, just while some of them were furious and voting no to the Treaty of Lisbon in June 2008. I was just wanting to ask the three speakers, do you think that there's any way that the disintegration of Yugoslavia, like you have the 6 republics, you have the 2 autonomous regions of Serbia, could have been handled better to respect the various, not just the linguistic diversity amongst the 6 republics, but also the alphabetic diversity as well? Like Croatians always felt that their medieval Glagolitic script, we had an exhibition of Glagolitic script in the Long Library in Trinity 2 years ago. And again, the Arabic script used the Bosanski Jezika as the Bosnian language could have been handled better, that the disintegration of Yugoslavia could be handled better to respect the linguistic, the alphabetic diversity and the other diversity of the various peoples within the major republics and the minority peoples trapped within the various republics by the borders which were written after 1992. And I don't just mean that in respect of Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, but also Kosovo, Vojvodina as well, and the other republics too, Macedonia and Croatia as well.
Quite a question. Could it have been handled better?
Thomas.
It's more
yes and no. Yeah. See, the answer is always like this. And if you want to argue for it, I was trying to show that Central and Eastern Europe, in a way, it's a very special region in the world from the point of view how nations and nation-states are built and legitimized, because they are legitimized and built on the basis of language. So if you define a nation and a nation-state through language only, and you believe that such a nation and nation-state should have only one language, so in a way, when on a territory which is a single state, people believe that there are several languages, and they believe in this principle of ethno-linguistic nationalism, one language, one nation, one state, that's it. The state needs to break up, basically, because people believe so, in a way. That's why in Central Europe it's still so difficult for states to grant any rights to ethno-linguistic minorities and national minorities. And let's say, in case of Poland, it took almost 20 years, because only in 2005, some ethnic and national minorities, not all of them, got the right to use their languages.
The German speakers, the Belarusian speakers, the Ukrainian speakers,
let's say, but the biggest national minority, according to the last census, Silesian speakers, and the Silesian language, they are not recognized. Yeah. So it's
trying to do.
It is still important somehow, ideologically, in this region, that language is the basis of nationhood and statehood. And states and people who are leading the state are afraid if there is a language recognized, it can lead to the split up of the country. And the theory is a self-fulfilling prophecy, as long as the population at large and elites believe in the ideological importance of language. Let's say, if you look westward, it does, here, for example, you speak English, but it doesn't mean that this country must go together with the US and with England and become one country. Yeah? The belief in ethno-linguistic nationalism doesn't exist here, in a way. And when you take German-speaking countries, they can perfectly, at least now after the Second World War, exist separately and do not have any intentions on the other ones to create a greater German-speaking German. But not at that moment. And everything changes, so you couldn't say. In a way, communism in Central Europe, in the case of Yugoslavia and in the case of the Soviet Union, tried to contain, as I've already said, nationalism, and it was successful. Simply, you could argue that in the case of Yugoslavia, it could have survived if the communist system would have continued on.
Do you want to come in at all on this?
Just one remark. There are two actually notions, minority language and migrant languages. And minority languages are spoken by people who live for 3 generations in the same territory, so to say. So, well, they have a different status than migrant languages, although the idea behind them is just the same. They are different languages from the mainstream of the so-called state language.
I'm not an expert of language, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we'd like to take just one more question. I think we really need to close up because I'm looking at the time. Please, go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Petrovsky. You described in your lecture modern art as the post-1989, just kind of talking about the museums in reference to how they portray the art before 1989. But elsewhere, modern art is defined as basically the art of the 20th century after the departure from realistic portrayal and more abstract. Is this a tendency in the history of arts in the Eastern Bloc now to kind of define the modern art after 1989, or is it just something you use?
Well, this is this relationship between the modern art, maybe abstract art, and realism is it's basically speaking connected with the whole discussion, the modernist discussion. But the postmodern discussion is completely different. And generally speaking, art critics, artists, are saying that the language is less important than the content. So if we consider the postmodern art, the late neo-avant-garde art, such questions, such art as conceptual art, for example, which is the core of neo-avant-garde. So the question of the politics, of the visualities, or style is completely non-important. People are using many different mediums and languages in order to express some issues. That could be video, could be installation, could be painting as well, but doesn't matter which ones. Could be written text, just being shown on the wall. So I think this discussion is completely not important. The important is the question of attitudes or message. And in the 1990s, after 1989, so this is my recent project that I'm trying to complete maybe Christmas, that I will have more time to complete the manuscript. The most important approach was something what I called agoraphilia. Agoraphilia means a sort of public drive in the arts. So people, particularly in Eastern Europe, former Eastern Europe, wanted to participate in the public space. We call this critical art. Art which is commending, which is analyzing contemporary social and political life. So it has nothing to do with the history of modernism, or neither abstract art nor realism. So contemporary art is completely outside these questions, I would say. It's stressing the content, particularly critical content, to the reality. Of course, we have many things which would be called the commercial art being produced for the market, but also dealing with this sort of politics, as I said before.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a feeling there's many, many points being thrown out this evening we could discuss for a long time, but I'm looking at time. We've run over time, a quarter of an hour already, so I really think I'd better draw things to a close. And I'll just do so very briefly by asking you once again to join me in thanking our three speakers for a fascinating set of talks and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.